Welcome to the Moonlight Shorts. This is the official audio home for the fiction of author Misty Hamilton Smith and the stories of ink, root, and moonlight. From the surreal to the gritty, these tales explore every genre. Today's story is a journey through a landscape of sharp edges and glittering shards, where survival is found in the beauty of what remains. Around a dry ridge and down into a valley that looked frosted over, Mara pulled off the road and got out. What she was seeing took a moment to make sense. That shimmer wasn't winter. It rose from the ground itself, pale and slow, the way heat moves off blacktop in July. Except it had no business being there, and she couldn't have said why. She knew that, only that she did. Glass covered every street. Not shards flung wide by some single violence, but drifts, settled and thick. The way sand piles against a fence line after years of wind, maybe decades. Every building on both sides stood hollow, every window gone, every frame empty. And light passed straight through their walls, like they were already ruins on their way to becoming something else. Walking slowly, she found that glass shifted underfoot but didn't scatter. It had worked itself into the dust over time until it almost belonged there. Her grandfather had lived here. He never said much about it, except that it wasn't built for staying. And she'd taken that as a child to mean something ordinary. That it was too small or too quiet or didn't have enough work to keep a man. Now, breathing air that felt thin in a way she couldn't locate, she understood he'd meant something harder to say. It was like standing inside a room where someone had held their breath a long time and the breath never came back. He'd said the general store would be on the left, past the crossroads, and it was. He'd mentioned it only once, in a story he told when she was 9 and never told again. At 12 he'd bought a pocket knife there with his own money. And the man behind the counter had wrapped it in brown paper and said to keep it sharp. That one memory had survived so many others, and she'd spent years wanting to know why. A crooked door opened without much resistance. Inside, glass lay thick across the floor, and where shelves had collapsed long ago, only their shadows remained on the walls. Outlines and nail holes and hooks rusted in place. Crouching, Mara ran her hand through the pieces. Some were heavy and cloudy, plate glass from the storefront windows, while others were so thin they were nearly nothing, the kind that would have lined the upper frames. One fragment carried red along its edge, paint dried down to almost nothing, and she couldn't tell if it had been part of a sign or a child's drawing taped up from the inside. It slipped into her pocket before she'd made any decision to put it there. Going back out into the light, she heard something shift, a sound soft and lateral, like leaves dragged slowly across a porch. Wind had come up and was moving the glass across the street in slow, barely visible waves, and she stood watching it longer than she could account for. At the center of town stood a municipal hall with its roof caved in on one side, and around it glass had piled highest, drifts rising knee-high in places and catching afternoon light in long fractured lines. Mara climbed one of those drifts slowly, testing each step. Underfoot, shards compressed and held. From up there, everything opened, every street going soft at its edges, where dust had reclaimed it. Buildings leaning away from each other or toward each other in ways she couldn't quite sort out anymore. Glass ran across all of it and gave what remained a quality she couldn't look at straight on. Not beautiful exactly, but present in a way ruins usually weren't, as if something in the wreckage was still paying attention. A man stood at the far end of town, watching her. When she spotted him, he didn't move. After a moment he raised one hand, not in greeting but in some quieter acknowledgement. The way you'd signal someone across a long stretch of road when words wouldn't carry. She climbed down and walked toward him with glass, whispering under every step. Up close he was older than he'd looked from a distance, his face worn with a kind of exhaustion that didn't come from age alone but from staying somewhere past the point when staying still made sense. His clothes were clean. He waited without shifting until she was close enough to speak. "You're his granddaughter," he said. "You knew him." "I knew everyone." He looked past her, down the emptied street. Windows started going after the first bad storm. People replaced them, and they went again. Something wrong with the ground, or the frames, or both. Buildings kept settling. After a while, people stopped trying. Mara looked at the drifts around his feet. "And this is what grew," she said. He nodded. "Land doesn't grow much else anymore." He turned then and walked to the remains of the house behind him, lifted a board from across the doorway, and revealed a floor that was glassed from wall to wall. He stepped onto it without hesitating. "Your grandfather left before the worst of it." His back was still to her. He knew what this place was becoming. He used to say the land was tired, that it needed to rest. He turned and looked at her. "I always thought he was right about that." Mara stepped in beside him and felt the glass settle a fraction under her weight before it held. "Why did you stay?" He was quiet a moment before he answered. "Somebody had to be here who remembered what it looked like with the windows in." Walking back felt longer than the walk-in had been. Glass moved around her boots in slow adjusting waves, and Mara didn't look back until she'd reached the truck. That painted fragment had gone warm against her leg. It stayed in her palm on the drive out. For years, the story of the knife had seemed to be about the knife. About a boy who saved his own money and a man who wrapped his purchase in paper and said something worth carrying. But it wasn't about any of that. It was about a town before its breaking started, a store still standing with its windows still holding light, a man behind a counter who could give advice because the world around him still made advice worth giving. Her grandfather had kept that memory the way you keep a photograph of a place taken just before a flood, not out of any need to look at it, but because some losses you have to hold in your hands, or they take everything else with them when they go. Pulling out slowly, she left it all behind, and in her rearview mirror the glass went on, catching the last of the light, the way it had been doing long before she came and would go on doing long after she was gone. You have been listening to an original story by Misty Hamilton Smith. This piece was originally published on the Inkroot and Moonlight blog. To read the written version, or to support the author, please follow the link in the show notes. Thank you for listening.